My parents always favored my golden sister over me, but they finally had enough and sent her to a mental ward. I can't believe it's been a year since I last wrote. It felt like a lifetime ago, and for a while, I thought I was done sharing my story. But then, one day, something pulled me back. It was a bunch of private messages, people wanting to know what happened, wanting to hear more about my life. So, here I am, back to tell you all about it. A lot has happened, and most of what I'm about to share, I actually learned from my parents and grandparents. They filled in the gaps, told me things I never knew. Honestly, it's pretty wild, and even I sometimes have to remind myself that this is actually my life. Let's start with my sister. Remember Little Miss Sunshine? Well, after I left, things got even crazier for her. She was still stuck in that boarding school, and she was absolutely miserable. My parents thought it was the best place for her, that it would straighten her out. But she was determined to get out, no matter what. At first, she tried lying. She made up stories, tried to convince the teachers that something terrible was happening at home, anything to get them to send her back. But the teachers weren't buying it. They'd heard it all before. So, she changed tactics. She decided to become a rebel, a full-fledged bully. She picked fights with the other girls, bossing them around and demanding they follow her every whim. But guess what? The other girls didn't like being bullied. In fact, one day, they fought back. A whole group of them got into a huge brawl with my sister, leaving her bruised and scraped up. It didn't stop there. She went on a hunger strike, declaring she wouldn't eat a bite until my parents came and rescued her. My mom, bless her heart, almost hopped in the car right then and there, ready to bring her precious Bobby home. But my dad stopped her, reminding her that they were the ones who'd created this mess in the first place, by spoiling her rotten. Besides, the hunger strike only lasted a couple of days before her stomach started growling too loud to ignore. Remember how my sister was obsessed with junk food? Well, that hadn't changed. My mom felt sorry for her and tried sneaking her sweets at the boarding school. Can you believe it? Gummy bears, chocolate bars, all the stuff the doctor warned against. It didn't last long, though. My sister got caught, my parents had a massive fight, and the secret candy stash was shut down. Now, here comes the really crazy part. My sister, desperate to escape the boarding school, took things to a whole new level. Picture this. She's in the cafeteria, standing on a table, a knife in her hand, threatening to hurt herself unless they give her candy and send her home. Yes, you heard right. Candy and freedom. It was like something out of a movie, a really messed up movie. They tried to talk her down, brought her all the sweets they could find, but she wasn't giving up. Then, in a moment of chaos, she slipped, tumbling off the table. The fall was bad. A broken arm, a broken collarbone, and a concussion. That was the final straw. Even the boarding school had enough. They told my parents that once she recovered, she wasn't welcome back. But here's the thing, the boarding school wasn't the end of it. It was just the beginning of a whole new kind of nightmare. Because of her dramatic stunt with the knife, she landed herself in a mental ward, a place specifically for kids with serious emotional issues. Talk about jumping from the frying pan into the fire. This place was nothing like the boarding school. There was no escaping it. They made her go to therapy, put her on a strict healthy diet, and stripped her of all the junk food she craved. It was her own personal hell. They even diagnosed her with something called narcissism, which basically meant she thought she was the center of the universe and deserved to get everything she wanted. It all stemmed from my parents spoiling her for years, making her believe the world revolved around her. My mom, of course, wanted to swoop in and rescue her, Bobby, from this terrible place. But this time, my dad put his foot down. They got into a huge argument, and things got so heated that my mom grabbed a bottle off the counter and smashed it against my dad's face. The bottle shattered, cutting him badly, even cracking his cheekbone. Can you imagine? The police showed up, sirens wailing, and chaos erupted. My dad was rushed to the hospital, his face a bloody mess, while my mom was arrested and taken away in the back of a police car. She ended up in a mental hospital herself, facing the consequences of her own troubled past. Turns out, my mom had her own demons, stemming from a difficult childhood. She had this deep-seated need to overprotect and spoil my sister, afraid to let her face any kind of hardship. There was talk of divorce, a dark cloud hanging over our family. My parents started sleeping in separate rooms, the tension between them thick enough to cut with a knife. So, where was I in all of this? Well, I was turning 19, stepping into adulthood. My grandparents threw me a party at my favorite restaurant, a small glimmer of joy in the midst of the chaos. My parents showed up, looking strained and weary, and even my sister was allowed out of the mental ward for a few hours. It was like stepping back in time. There she was, my little sister, the same sour expression on her face, the same glare that could melt steel. She'd lost some weight because of the healthy food at the ward, but her personality hadn't changed a bit. She still couldn't stand not being the center of attention. When I blew out the candles on my cake, she didn't throw a tantrum like she did last year. No, this time she went for a different tactic. She burst into tears, these big, dramatic sobs, and started wailing, "Why? Why, why?" She was like a tiny, tragic actress, putting on a show for everyone to see. I knew what she was doing. Manipulation, pure and simple. She realized that screaming wouldn't get her anywhere, so she switched to waterworks, hoping to guilt everyone into giving her what she wanted. She was only 9 years old, but she was cunning, always scheming, always figuring out how to bend people to her will. Remember how, at 8, she demanded a car just because I got one at 18? That was my sister in a nutshell. Her act continued throughout the party. She threw herself on the floor, kicking and screaming about the lack of pizza, the absence of gifts for her, no prizes, no special treatment. Then she started cursing at our parents, using language that would make a sailor blush. It was like she was trying to recreate what I did last year, except in her own twisted way. She thought that if she mirrored my behavior, she could escape the same way I did. But things didn't go as planned. My parents, exhausted and defeated, apologized to the other guests and took my sister home early. But not before my grandfather gave them a piece of his mind. He told them that they had to stop giving in to her demands, stop enabling her behavior, or this cycle would never end. He warned them that if they took her to another party, gave her the treats she craved, they would be right back where they started. My sister heard everything, and the realization that her tantrum had backfired hit her like a ton of bricks. She was dragged out of the restaurant kicking and screaming, a whirlwind of fury and frustration. She was driven back to the mental ward the next morning, her short-lived taste of freedom over. Nobody knew how long she would be there. She was just a kid, but she was the most stubborn person I'd ever met. It was clear that until she hit rock bottom, until she realized that her old tactics no longer worked, she'd be trapped in that place. The upside? No one, not even my parents, blamed me for my sister's actions. They finally understood that I wasn't the problem. They had raised her to believe she was a princess, catering to her every whim, and they were paying the price. They realized they were addicted to enabling her, trapped in a cycle of giving in to her every demand. Here's the strange part. From what I've heard, narcissism was the only official diagnosis they gave my sister. No other mental illnesses, nothing to explain the extreme behavior. She was actually quite smart, apparently having an IQ of around 110. But she refused to apply herself unless there was a reward involved. Years of being spoiled had turned her into a master manipulator, someone who only cared about what she could get out of people. It would likely take years of therapy and tough love to break her out of this mindset. As for me, well, I was doing okay. Adulting was hard, that much was certain. Learning to budget, pay bills, and take care of myself was a crash course in reality. But it was a million times better than living with my parents and sister, caught in their web of drama and dysfunction. Later, I learned that my sister's issues were even more complex than anyone had initially realized. Apparently, she had continued her self-destructive behavior even while confined to the mental ward. She threatened to harm herself if my parents didn't take her out for fast food. When they refused, she tried to hurt herself, banging her head against the wall. It was a terrifying pattern, a desperate plea for attention. My mother tried to keep these incidents quiet, afraid to admit the truth. But my father felt it was important to inform the ward about my sister's behavior. She was clearly a danger to herself, and they needed to know the extent of her issues. On top of everything else, my sister was also a compulsive liar. She made up stories about the doctors hurting her, fabricating tales of abuse. But her stories were inconsistent, always changing, always lacking evidence. It seemed she had a knack for creating chaos, for drawing people into her web of deception. So, it seemed there was more to her story than just narcissism. She was also prone to self-harm and pathological lying. It was a potent cocktail of issues, a recipe for disaster. And it explained why she was kept in a long-term ward. If she was allowed to come home, the cycle would likely start all over again. My parents would gradually cave to her demands, desperate for peace and quiet, and she would be back to her old tricks. Little Miss Sunshine was counting on it, using every weapon in her arsenal to escape the consequences of her actions.